Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Adventures Through the Mind. I'm your host, as always, James W. Jesso. This podcast explores topics relevant and related to psychedelic culture, medicine, and research, and always with an underlying question of how can we work with and through our psychedelic experiences to become better people for ourselves, for the most immediate relationships we have, for the world, and for those who have yet to walk this earth, those who we will go before. And so today's podcast is actually a conversation with Dr. Darcia Narvaez and what she calls the evolvedness. Now, Dr. Narvaez has been on the show previously, which I'll speak to in a second, and this is going to be a complement to that previous episode. But as we do here at Adventures Through the Mind, as I'm going to read a little overture that I wrote for this episode, which more or less will also be available to read over at jameswjesso.com, episode 158. And so here we go. This is the overture for this episode. Is this what human life is? Is the world we find ourselves in today, with all this strife and war and hatred and polarization and commercialization and extortion and the rest, is this what it is to be human? Is this what humanity has brought to bear upon ourselves and the world? Or is it perhaps that where we are now is an amalgamated expression of having lost our humanity somewhere along the way? And if this is the case, that we have lost our humanity somewhere along the way, then what might our humanity mean? How did we get so far away from it? And how might we return to a thriving human existence? It is these questions that are explored by our guest for this episode, Dr. Darcia Narvaez. Darcia Narvaez is a professor emerita of psychology at the University of Notre Dame, Indiana, in the USA. She is a fellow of the American Psychological Association, the American Educational Research Association, and the American Association for the Advancement of Science. She studies moral development and human flourishing from an interdisciplinary perspective, integrating anthropology, neuroscience, clinical, developmental, and educational sciences. She has published hundreds of papers and over 20 books. She serves as president of kindredworld.com. She blogs for Psychology Today under the series Moral Landscapes, and hosts the webpage evolvedness.org. She was on the show, the podcast previously, way back in episode 52, called Primal Parenting and the Evolved Nest. And, well, what is the evolved nest? Simply stated, it is the early life context that leads to human thriving. And it consists of 9 components, which Dr. Narvaez is going to do like a crash course on all of that at the very beginning of this interview. So although the previous episode actually has quite a bit of value, and I would encourage you to listen to it, although maybe not watch it because my beard situation back then was a little obscene, but that's besides the point. Excellent episode, but Dr. Narvaez is going to give us a crash course in it before we explore even more deeply before we focus on the impact 10,000 years of unnested children is having on our psychology, our morality, and our civilization as a whole. We also explore how early life nesting experiences leads to what Narvaez calls cycles of cooperative companionship, and how the undercare of being unnested leads to cycles of competitive detachment, the cycle most of us are locked into now, a cycle that is definably unhuman. Furthermore, we explore what it means and what it takes to break the competitive detachment cycle and come back into healthy connection with ourselves, each other, and the natural world. So that's what we're going to explore today here on this episode of the podcast. Again, so how can we work with and through our psychedelic experiences to be better people in the world. At some point, we explore this a little bit later on when I talk to Dr. Narvaez about the ninth component, healing practices, routine healing practices as a part of this evolved nest. But I'll leave my commentary on it here because you're going to hear it later in the episode. Couple of points before we get into the episode, one of which is Dr. Narvaez was having some sort of weird glitchy thing happening with her audio. So there's this like clicking sound that you'll hear. It doesn't happen very much, but it does happen a bit at the beginning. So fine tune your mind in order to intentionally unfocus on that sound so you can more conscientiously focus on what she's saying for those brief periods of time that it is present. The second thing before we get into this episode is a big thank you to my patrons on Patreon, especially the people whose names are listed on the screen here on YouTube or in the description to this episode, including the people who have left one-time donations, also listed on the screen and in the description to this episode. Thank you very much, especially since my car accident back in January and the weird journey of healing and rehabilitating and coming to understand how impactful a head injury can be. Having continued patronage and funding coming through for the podcast and coming through into my life so I can take care of myself and my base needs, even as I'm still in the process of trying to rehabilitate back up to producing podcasts for you and the schedule being more inconsistent than it has been. I am just so grateful that you've stuck around. So thank you so much. And to everyone who has offered funding as well. It's been really, really appreciated. And I genuinely hope that you really like this episode. It was recorded before the car accident. And third point is, if you'd like to listen to that original interview with Dr. Narvaez, it will be linked in the show notes to this episode. And if you're at YouTube, I'm going to auto link it to one of the corners. I don't know where to point on the screen, but there's a card that's going to pop up now on YouTube. And that's all. Please enjoy this episode of Adventures Through the Mind, episode 158 with Dr. Darcia Narvaez. Enjoy. Also, I'm very excited. I love your work so much, and I'm so excited. Doctor,
just which topics?
Oh, which topics? We're gonna the evolved nest, especially recently. I followed your work, and we did that interview a few years back. It had a lot to do with child rearing. That was my mindset at the time, was thinking about how it impacted child rearing, because I was in a situation where I was now around small children. I was in my family, like living in my family home. So it was this interesting context of, as an adult, returning back to live in my parents' house while also being present to my sister just having a baby, and like reliving from a different mindset, both like the relationship I had with my parents and thus had with my parents, and then watching their behaviors around the small children and observing my own. So at the time, your work around, like the different sort of neurobiological impacts and sort of which psychosocial neurobiological impact of child rearing practices was very relevant. And okay, so we're in the interview now. Dr. Darcia Narvaez, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here with you. And
so that was my focus at the time. And so in this interview, and recently, when I found the short 6-minute documentary that you put out with a colleague of yours, I'm sorry, what is her name?
Lisa Reagan from Kindred World.
Excellent. Yeah. So you put out the Break the Cycle short documentary, and that got me back into like, oh wow, how much your work has evolved over the years with the evolved nest. And so for this interview, I would love to get sort of more deeply into the two kinds of cycles that you have sort of tracked playing out, in contrast between nested people and unnested people, the cycles of cooperative companionship, the cycles of competitive detachment. And I want to get a sense of them, and maybe I have some things I'm wondering about, like things that are happening in the world now, and how do we see these cycles playing out in these different scenarios, if at all? and what sort of insight your evolved nest, I don't know, it's a word, theory or like model, sort of illuminates about these things that we're facing in the world now. So with that said, it would be good for the listeners who probably haven't listened to the earlier episode, or hopefully they did, but just get a general understanding of what the evolved nest is and why it's an important thing to understand in the discussion we're going to have today about the two different cycles that you outline in your work.
All right. Well, we have a lot to talk about, so all stuff that makes me excited. The evolved nest is a term we use for the developmental system our species evolved to support the optimal development of the young. Every animal has a nest. We can just call it a nest, even though we're not all birds. They're all set up to match the maturational schedule of the young. Our nest is particularly intense because we're born so immature. We only have 25% of the adult brain volume at birth, at full-term birth. And it takes years to reach adult levels, actually 3 decades. But so much happens in those first 6 years. And the earlier years, even more is happening because you're setting up how the brain's going to work, how the body and brain are going to communicate in multiple systems. We resemble fetuses till we're about 18 months of age. And so Ashley Montague suggested that we need an external womb experience after birth for months and months. Now, this is all just to give you a sense of why the evolved nest components are so important. And what are they? They are prenatal, perinatal, soothing experiences. So a relaxed pregnancy experience, a relaxed, soothing birth experience. All these things are imprinting the brain. So a lot of epigenetics happening. So we have gene packets, these biochemical packets that we inherit, but they're not really activated unless there's certain experiences at particular times of sensitive periods when they're supposed to be kind of turned on, so to speak, or off. And so it's really important then to have these soothing experiences so that the biochemistry of the baby's body is a growth promoting chemistry. If you stress the mother when she's pregnant, if you stress the baby at birth or after birth extensively, routinely, sensitive times, these things can have long-term consequences then on how the rest of all those systems are growing. So the evolved nest involves then the soothing perinatal experiences. It then also includes breastfeeding. And breastfeeding is part of our mammalian heritage. Animals have been breastfeeding now or giving fluids to their young for at least 70 million years old now. Some they're saying spiders 400 million years. So it's really normal for every animal to provide nutrition from the body of the mother, usually to the offspring. And our needs are so great because the brain is growing so quickly. It's thousands of synapses or brain connections are taking place every minute in the baby, and the biochemistry has to be right. And breast milk provides the right biochemistry. It's washing the body and brain with the chemicals that are needed to grow a healthy system, the precursors to neurotransmitters, for example. And breast milk is different in the morning than it is at night. The night milk has soothing and sleep-inducing ingredients, whereas the morning milk has energizing ingredients. So breast milk is designed then again to help that baby grow optimally. And this is always a shocker for our species. The average age of weaning that's been observed around the world in societies that provide the nest, the average age to discontinue breastfeeding is age 4. So it's like, oh my God, really? Say the people from industrialized societies, right? And that's the average, right? So some kids in some societies are breastfeeding even longer than 4 years. Why? We know, for example, that the immune system takes about that long to reach adult levels of functioning. And so breast milk is providing all the immunoglobulins to build that system. So those are two that's birth and perinatal, breastfeeding. Then there's a welcoming climate. So that means the baby is wanted, the baby is enjoyed, feels like they belong, that they're attended to, their needs are met through responsive care, meaning that you keep that baby in a calm state where the biochemistry again is in the growth orientation rather than the stressed orientation. We know when you stress a young child that the cortisol levels will increase, and if they reach, if that goes on too long, that cortisol will melt brain connections. Will melt the things that are supposed to be growing, right, or prevent them from growing. So you don't want to stress a baby. You want to keep them calm. And so that's responsive care. Then there's multiple adult caregivers. So this is not all on mom. This is a community. The nest is provided by the community. So that would be father, grandmother, and even non-kin are there to be responsive to that child. And one of the things they need as well is lots of touch and caring. So babies need to pretty much be in arms or on bodies 24/7 in those first months of life. And then as they become more mobile, we need to follow their intuitions about what they need to do. So to explore, to test things out. But then they always want to come back and be held and carried and such. So just following the baby's needs is going to help them grow all the things they need to grow, because they have the internal compass for what's good, what's optimally going to help them reach their potential. So that's then we have the birth, the breastfeeding, the responsiveness, the multiple caregivers, the affectionate touch, the welcoming climate. And then there's also self-directed play, social play. So we are mammals. Young mammals play. When they feel well and safe, they are going to run around and play with other mammals. You see that with puppies, you see it with kittens, you see it with monkeys, you see it with kids. And this is an activity that is self-directed. So this is not organized sports or something like that. This is something that the child is now having to interact with the playmate, and ideally with different age groups and different settings. And they interact, and they're growing then their capacity to stop and start actions, to control their aggression. You can't be overly aggressive with your playmate or they'll stop playing with you. So you learn to, figure that out. And all this is executive functioning. So it's that prefrontal cortex, which is really important for guiding your life later, your practical wisdom. Then there's nature immersion and nature connection. So we evolved to be co-evolved with our landscapes, with the trees and animals, plants, rivers, mountains, to be immersed there and to feel connected, to feel like they're part of our community. And you need to have a lot of experiences with, hopefully, wild nature to build that sense of confidence and cooperation and relationship. And then the last one is we've added now, this is 9 components then to the evolved nest. We've added routine healing practices. So in our ancestral context, places where they provide the nest routinely and are not preoccupied with working and the industrialized context that we're in now, they have routine healing practices to let go of grief, to let go of resentment, to have dancing and singing together. And that bonds the community together, that helps them let go of those things that were irritants and to reconnect and rebalance the self and rebalance relationships, and also attend to the needs of the bio community. So to be in Native American communities, ceremonies all day long, you're giving thanks and showing gratitude for the gifts that the earth is providing, the plants and animals and such, for your nutrition, for example. And so these kinds of routine ways of being a community member, of balancing your inner and outer self with the rest of the web of life is really important too. So that's the evolved nest.
So just as a quick reference, just at the end there, can you name all 9 of them one after another?
Yes. So there's soothing perinatal experiences that includes birth, but also pre-birth, prenatal. There's breastfeeding. There's a welcoming climate, responsive care, so keeping the baby contented, multiple adult caregivers, play, self-directed play, affectionate touch. I think I didn't say that one. And also no corporal punishment. Corporal punishment misdirects development. It orients the child to self-centeredness.
By corporal punishment, you mean abuse,
spanking,
aka spanking. I know spanking to me is a euphemism for hitting your child, but I just wanted to clarify that means spanking.
Yes, So spanking. Unfortunately, in the U.S., half of parents say they spank their 1-year-olds, so it's really distressing. And then those last 2 are nature connection, nature immersion and connection, and then routine healing practices. So there's 9. Mm-hmm. You can go to evolvednest.org, and then they're all explained there.
And you have a number of incredible pieces of content around this, 2 hours and hours of incredible content for people who want to go from this interview and really dive deep into what you've been doing. Okay, so something I'd like to clarify is that, you had mentioned that this early nest experience, this evolved nest experience, is important for the development of the child. In particular, we're speaking to their nervous system. And part of your work involves that these early life experiences influence the nervous system. We could just say that's like the physical side of the coin of being a human. But there's this whole other side of things. So we have the neurobiological development, like you said, the epigenetic impact on how we respond to stress, how our immune system functions, and all the rest. But also there's this psychological impact too, where the type of early care you experience influences, your sort of, this is my language, sort of perceptual tendencies, relational patterns, sense of self, and even moral and ethical behaviors coming straight out of your early life experiences and then translating out into the kind of culture that you make by how you conduct yourself, but also the kind of culture you participate in, which, linking back, is the kind of culture that informs the child rearing. And so that when you have a nested community, when you have nested children, you end up having nested adults that have nested sort of cultural ways in the world. And when you have unnested children, or children in a degraded nest, you have adults who they're unnested, and they have cultural and behavioral relational patterns from unnested people, which feeds back into how they raise their children. And so I'm trying to characterize that our early life experiences impact our physiological, neurophysiological, endocrinological, is that a word? Immune function as adults, but also our psychological, relational, behavioral, cultural tendencies too. And that this is important because if we are raised in a degraded nest situation, that has very direct impact and negative impact on our lives and on the lives of others. And so the sort of consequence of, and I know that this might be maybe too reductionistic, but the consequence of nested versus unnested, sort of maybe reductionist bifurcation here, would be like nested, they enter a certain kind of cycle of behavior, self-understanding, and culture, and unnested would go into a different cycle. And you've characterized these 2 different cycles. I'd love to start hearing about first the cycle that emerges out of nested children, nested adults, and a context of how you came to understand that. And by this, I mean, small band hunter-gatherer nomadic groups that you've studied over the years. And then what that cycle is and what it looks like before contrasting it with the unnested cycle, which is the one that most of us will have experienced because of the kind of world that we, for the vast majority of us, have grown up in. So I know that's a big thing, but the question is sort of, can you talk about the cycles that emerge out of nested children and nested adults, and what that cycle is and what it looks like?
Yeah, so it's really been a pathway of discovery to come up with these cycles. I read widely, so it's really a transdisciplinary view. You have to, examine all the kind of scholarship about how humans are raised, how they act, and what their capacities are, and what that means for how they treat the next generation. And so we can see in the hunter-gatherer communities, and there's a great book called Hunter-Gatherer Childhoods that inspired me for coming up with this. And you can see there that these characteristics of the nest seem to matter, right? Why is it that they're all over the world in these communities where they're not stressed by globalization and such? And then you can, if you look at the neuroscience, neurobiological sciences, the clinical sciences, then you can see that there's a link between those nest components and what capacities a brain or a person has. And then you can see that the neurobiology of the child's, from the child's experiences, are related to the adult's capacities. And then those adults, their whole perception is oriented to how they were raised. They tend to then do the same thing to their kids. So in the early years, the neurobiological set points for all sorts of systems are established. And if you're in the stressed, unnested, or degraded nest environment, your capacities are going to be hampered. They're going to be impaired to some degree. Excuse me. The stress response is a major system that is getting established in the early years about when it's going to kind of kick in, when it's going to be activated. And if you're stressed a lot, that means you're going to have a habitual high kind of reactivity. You're going to be hyper reactive to stress because you never learn to be calm, right? So that's why it's so important to keep babies calm, because you practiced and practiced whatever it was, screaming to get your needs met. That's going to be your go-to, right? That's what your default will be. And it actually then you carry it forward into adulthood, immediately go into that stress response. Your free will. There's no free will there. You're conditioned to be hyper reactive. And what it does physiologically is it takes the blood flow away from your higher order thinking into your muscles, because it's fight or flight, right? Stress response is set up for us to run away from tigers and jaguars. It's not set up for getting along with other people, but that's because you've been in an unnested environment where the social relations are threatening, that they're not providing the nest. They're more intrusive or manipulative or neglectful. And so you don't trust relationships. And so in your adulthood, when you face, you actually become threat reactive. You see threat everywhere. And then your stress response is going off all the time, which we know chronic stress reactivity is related to physical health problems as well as the psychological. And when that's occurring, your morality is going to be all about me. Mm-hmm. Can't think. You're not thinking relationally in a compassionate, open-hearted way. It's just not possible because your biology is set up for protection and bracing against the other, right? Or withdrawing, either fighting, being oppositional, or withdrawing and not really being there, dissociated or just shrinking down and submitting. So that's the cycle that we are in the States, the United States in particular, because we're so undercaring for our children in so many ways, and then traumatizing them as well. In all sorts of ways too, and the adults keeping everyone in a fear state. And when you're in the fear state, your blood flow isn't going to be towards, open-heartedness and relaxation and connection. So I'm sorry, so I'm talking about the negative stuff. So the positive stuff is really important for promoting what we call the connected cooperative companionship cycle. The nestedness leads to a great neurobiology where you're flexible and you're attuned so this is intelligence is all about flexibility, that you're able to come to a situation, see its uniqueness, and respond in ways that are appropriate for that situation. And your adulthood is about being well and developing wisdom. And then you create a culture that keeps this cycle going because you are able to see what's important. You can see that when you provide the nest to your child, they turn into a cooperative citizenship, a citizen or a community member. And that's just part of what you know. And the stories you tell about your community is that we are a cooperative, united group that loves one another, that we are open to others, that we welcome the stranger, that we're hospitable. These are the stories you tell in that connected cooperative companionship community.
Right, and that's part of how the narrative space of the culture also is a practical space, but the narrative space of the culture starts to inform the worldview that comes out of a nested children.
That's right. And so the other cycle, the unnested cycle, we call it the competitive detachment. So it's a disconnected competitive detachment cycle because in early life, the child is broken off from relationship pretty quickly. That can happen in gestation when the mother's stressed all the time. And so the baby's getting the biochemistry that's not conducive to good growth. And at birth, there's medicalized birth is often traumatic for mother and child and disconnects their normal, naturalistic bonding interests that right at birth. They want to bond. All their reward systems are ready to just glom onto each other like a mind melding and body melding. But if they're separated, if the baby's treated with painful procedures, things like that, that's undermined, weakened. And then the breastfeeding that a lot of moms are told that doesn't matter, that formula is just as good. It's a million miles different. It's just so incredibly different. Formula is great for emergencies, but it should not be the default. And we've set up systems, though, we're more profit oriented. So all these things that are undermining childcare, the nest, are because you make money from people being sickly, from doing all these interfering things we do to children. And so the systems, the incentives are all backwards. And then for touch, some moms have a baby and they don't want to touch their baby after birth. Why? Well, their systems were not set up properly in their own childhood. So the vagus nerve is the 10th cranial nerve, and it runs through all the major systems of the body, innervates them, and it needs to be established in early life by calming, responsive care. And if it isn't, if you're left alone a lot, you're left to cry as a baby, this system can be, the nerve will not be established properly, and you'll have various health problems. And one of those health problems is you're not interested in being too intimate with someone else. You may not want to be touched because it just makes you feel, threatened. And so moms may not have that system set up well, and they don't want to hold their baby. Well, then we have, the cascading effects across generations, that when one group is unnested, the next generation is even less nested, and the next and the next. And we're in that cycle.
Sure. And then that plays out, and sorry to interrupt here. I want to expand it out into sort of how we conduct ourselves as adults, not necessarily with our children. That is very evident. And also you and I have a podcast where we go quite deeply into that, which is how this impacts then how we interact with other adults in the world. Because, you spoke about, a lot of this degrading of childcare, child rearing practices is profit driven. While much of our, in the United States and Canada, the sort of, would say, global civilizational sort of profit agenda, consumerist profit industrial agenda, is very much sort of an undermining of, like Gabor Mate says, like something like it is it is founded on the denial of human needs. And it changes how we show up in the world. So you talk about this heightened stress response thing, seeing threat everywhere. We can't connect if we're in that kind of place, but we do strategize to keep ourselves safe. And you talk about how when we're in the cycle of competitive detachment, our nervous systems, our sense of self, our sort of assessment of the world is all being informed by these unnested conditions. There's a sort of a pattern of sort of safety or like strategic sort of attempts at safety that are sort of characterized by being in this place. You talk about it as dominant and submissive. Can you talk a little bit about how and why that plays out in social circumstances, and then maybe expand that into how that then impacts the sort of health of a community? We won't go all the way up into society. That would become evident, but how that would interact in the health of a community, be it a work community, personal community, etc.
Right. So our neurobiology has multiple aspects to it. And Paul MacLean had a try-and brain theory that's been disputed, and the evidence is that it's much more complicated than what he was telling us. But what was important about his theory is that he described the mindsets that we can get into, a global mindset. And that's what my triune ethics theory, meta theory is about. So when you stress, well, there's three, I'll just say the three aspects are self-protectionism, which I've called safety or security system, but self-protectionism is more of an accurate term. Engagement, social engagement, relational attunement, and then the imagination, which builds on one or the other. So when you're undercared for, when you're unnested, or when you feel extreme threat, if you have been a nested person, you'll go into this self-protection mode, because that's what your body doesn't want to die, right? And so it takes over and then shifts the blood flow and makes you oriented to finding ways to be safe. And so I'll just say a little bit more about that. In the nested case, those systems are not enhanced. They're there because we inherit them, they're innate, but they're not conditioned up. In the unnested condition, they're conditioned up to take over your personality. In the nested condition, you are growing your relational attunement. There's so many sub-skills and skills to get along with others, to read expressions and communicate, and all sorts of things that happen not before you can talk. You have to learn a whole bunch of things. And then when you're speaking and relating, and play is the greatest way to regrow all that stuff. If you're an adult and trying to heal yourself, go play with a little kid, run around. And then the imagination is when our abstract thinking capacities come on board, in early adolescence usually. They're going to link into either that protectionist orientation, or they're going to link into that communal relational attachment connectedness. And so you can see in our ancestral context, places where the nest is provided, the imagination is used to get along with others in a positive way. Whereas in the unnested conditions, which we see now widespread in the United States, I think, we've got so many people so stressed, they're staying in their stressed or survival mode, the protectionism mode, and then they're using their imagination to control or manipulate others. Now, capitalism, sort of predatory capitalism, has encouraged that. Mm-hmm. Charles Derber, the sociologist, has suggested that the U.S., to get ahead in business, you have to be a sociopath. Mm-hmm. And we got tons of sociopaths all over. So anyway, so that way of being, then you carry forward into your everyday life, and you treat others in this dominant submission orientation, which is the survival old systems, pre-human systems that we carry because they've been conditioned up. You're oriented either you have to be a winner or else you're a loser. There's only this dualistic view, and there's inflexibility. So a lack of social emotional intelligence because that stuff didn't grow properly. You weren't nested at the time when it was supposed to be growing.
And so one of the things that I've heard you speak to is that when we're in a scenario, this is activated, there's an inclination in us strategically using our imagination, like you said, sort of like predatory, get things out of people. And there are two ways to do that you've outlined. We dominate or we become submissive. So we either become a bully to become sort of like the top of, say, for example, a supremacy structure, or like, depending on if you think about Sarah Schulman's work, our trauma could also create a type of supremacy structure around us needing our sort of traumatic narratives validated. But we either sort of go into a dominated place or we go into a submissive place where we find the bully and then we sort of align ourselves underneath them to be safe as a consequence. Again, we see this in supremacy structures. So can you talk a little bit more about how that plays out? Anything that you'd like to expand or speak to on that?
Well, in the social community, then you're going to have tribes. Now, the assumption that there's just so much misunderstanding about our human heritage. There's the belief that we're oriented to in-group and out-group, that we're all about purity, and if you're not one of us, then we can't take you. That's what happens when you undercare for kids, which civilization has done for millennia now. When you do that, you are enhancing those old systems, the pre-human systems, which are oriented to in-group, out-group, towards, making sure you're one of us and not one of them. Those kinds of authoritarian tendencies are not our human heritage. We have moved beyond that. We move beyond the apes, the chimpanzees hierarchy orientation to an egalitarian orientation that was promoted by the evolved nest. So women cooperating in particular, but the community cooperating to raise the children with the evolved nest actually emphasized then the egalitarianism, which is not a static thing. It was, the anthropologists are now finding and telling us that women would rise up, and get mad at the guys for having too much power, and then the guys would and there's this flow back and forth. And according to the lunar cycle in many societies, which is quite interesting. And so it's not that we have to suppress ourselves and to become a moral person. It's that we forgot how to raise a moral person. Excuse me. We forgot that early experience matters for the morality later, right? So there's a connection by how we are seeded, how we are grown, what we blossom into, and then our moral orientation. If we have been unnested, we're going to be oriented to that dominant submission, and we think that's normal, and we think that's what humans are. And we excuse ourselves for being selfish and aggressive. I'm just being a human. No, you are. You've been unnested. You've been stressed, overly stressed in the wrong ways at the wrong times. And this is a pretty human tendency rather than the human tendency, which would be, I'm here and I'm always connected to everything. I'm connected to you, you stranger. How am I like you? In our Marvin Bram, the historian, and others have pointed out how prior to the extreme civilization we have now, we used to be able to de-differentiate ourselves from others, to see how we were like them. And Native American traditions are to emphasize how you are like this tree, you are like the river, you are like the stone, you are like, that we are all in this dynamic flow of life. And to have a sense of that, I call it receptive intelligence. So when we undermine children's early development, we're undermining that capacity to perceive how the natural world is part of us and we are part of it. And there's this dynamism. It's not either or. It's not black and white. It's the kind of what's called polysemy, the polymorphism, the ability to shape shift. That depending on the circumstance, your identity shifts. You don't have a rigid identity, which is what's happened now. We get very rigid when we have been undercared for, and we stick to one identity, something that makes us feel safe, right? It's being an American, or it's having a gun. oh, it's having this viewpoint about whatever it is. And then we hang on to that. And if someone threatens that, oh my God, it's the end of the world for me, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
So
it's
that,
like a life threat. You're so desperately holding on to the certainty of an ideology, for example, that anyone who challenges that ideology and the identity is so rigidly associated or sort of like linked that, and this is something I've been considering for quite a while, is like the ideology is challenged and the nervous system response to that is a life challenge. You're threatening you're threatening me. And so the threat of the ideology is responded to with a type of sort of like defense of my life. And then things can get extremely aggressive very quickly. Yeah. So I added that comment and interrupted you. So please continue if you had more to say there.
No, maybe ask a question.
Okay, great. So maybe this is another comment. It's coming out of what you just said, but also sort of how I'm reading your work. I mean that figuratively, I'm literally reading your work, but then also figuratively how I'm reading and coming to my own thoughts about it is something like, you say that these unnested cycles we see now is not how humans are. Your language is something like 95% of human history has been in the cycle of cooperative companionship. And the cycle of competitive detachment is something that has emerged in the last 10,000 years out of our sort of modern civilizational sort of arc to where it is now. And one of the ways that I'm thinking about that, and as you said, we think, I've heard the phrase, I'm only human. Sometimes that's because we make mistakes. Okay, that makes sense. But other times it's like because the mistakes are aggressive or whatever. So I'm only human is another way of saying like, well, I'm only a dumb, stupid, rugged, individualistic, selfish ape because that's what humans are. And in a sense, it makes me feel like, well, no, actually, that's not human. That's sort of unhumaned Homo sapiens, perhaps. And so what you're speaking of, what a human is maybe sort of like the thing that expresses our humanity. And it's funny that we think humans are these horrible creatures, while at the same time, we prize our humanity as something of like value, anyways. And it leads me to think about Stephen Jenkinson saying like humans are not born, humans are made, and they're made by culture, which is speaking to your work, but not so specifically or incidentally speaking to your work. But that we don't presently live in a culture, a human culture. We live in a kind of an unculture, and the consequences unhuman Homo sapiens, unhumaned Homo sapiens. Did you want to comment on that at all?
Yes, I like that. It's a good way to put it. I think when people say humans are made, I think they often think that it's the socialization of the parents teaching the child to, do this or that, or punishing them this way or that way. And that you have to train the conscious mind how to be moral. That's the Enlightenment view, that it's reason that guides our morality. And my work and my argument is, no, it's the neurobiology. It bubbles up, and then you rationalize, and then you make up stories, right, for whatever it is that's bubbling up. And you're disconnected. So what happens in an unnested environment is you're disconnected from who you are. You can't follow your intuitions. You were not encouraged to follow your uniqueness, your spirit, your heart. Because they left you to cry, they left you alone to sleep alone. They didn't meet your needs. They didn't recognize your signals. And so you end up in that survival mode, your gut reactions that are oriented to just, how am I going to survive in the next moment or the next, right now? And then you go to school, then you're sent to school. And the school's all about this head stuff, right? It's about information. It's about, learning facts. And so you have a disconnected person. You've got the gut feeling, and then you got the head feeling. And moral psychology's looked at that and said, oh, there's a gap. People say they're going to do this. They think because they learned the right words and, reasoning about how to act. But then when they get in a situation, they don't act like that. They follow whatever their gut has been trained to, how they've felt themselves to be safer. So what's missing in our education, and we break people's into the id, the ego, the superego. That's all civilization doing that, splitting the person into these units. And then they can't get along, or they're just so disconnected. They're different parts of us. Whereas in a nested environment, you're a whole person, and your heart-centeredness is key. For most societies, that's what it means to be human. You are thinking with your heart. You're aware always of your relationships, of your impact on others, that you have an option to either enhance the other or detract and harm the other. And every moment, which way do you go? In a heart-centered life, you are leaning towards connection. You are leaning towards enhancing the relationships, the well-being of humans and the other than humans. Whereas in an unnested environment, you are, shifting from your whatever you were learned that you were supposed to say and think, and then you're moving into your gut, your reactions, your self-protectionism, and then you look like a hypocrite because there's no connection there, right? And your heart is like absent. It's like you've locked it away because it wasn't safe to be you. It wasn't safe to be vulnerable and to share and be generous. So you brace. Right. And you lock that down. And so for healing as an adult, you've got to revamp and reconnect to yourself, and then learn how to, enhance the joy and the well-being of others.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a I'm crossing my finger as a reminder to finish what I'm about to say with something else that follows up and where I'd like to go. You talk about like how you're raised, and then you go into the school, and it's like this further disconnect. And then I think about, and then you start going to work, and and the school trains you for this, which is regardless of how you feel or what you need, you got to show up for work and do what you're told, which is another hierarchy structure, submission, dominance, all the rest. And then that eventually degrades your life. So you go to a therapist, and most therapists are trained on CBT, which says, well, the problem is that your thinking isn't right. You need to learn how to use your thinking to suppress and actively work against your intuitions. That's health. So that's like a whole other possible conundrum that we'll maybe just leave. But one of the things that you were mentioning there about going towards connection, that when we're nested, we're like offering connection. And the framing that came to mind is like, and this is going to link back to explicitly a part of your work, is that when we're nested, we're full, and it's like our inclination to offer connection to others. Like maybe the difference between being a permaculture garden, and we're like, oh, everything, or like monocropped hydroponics or something. We need what's ours compared to offering. So when we're nested, we want to offer connection, and that sort of, it goes back and forth. And then you get this cycle of cooperative companionship, because we're offering connection with each other, because connection is our foundation. And so it's from there. But then when we don't have connection in our foundation, it's fair to assume that if it's not connection, it's disconnection, because an absence of care, an absence of an essential nutrient such as connection, is harmful. As you've spoken to, the absence of a certain component of the nest is actively harmful. If I don't get enough B12, I get sick and die. If I don't get enough touch, I get sick and die, as an infant, for example. And this leads into something that you've talked about what it is to live the everyday life in unnested societies. So if I'm nested, I'm in connection, I'm offering connection, I'm sharing connection. If I'm unnested, I'm in disconnection, but some part of me knows that I need connection, or I need what I don't know I need. It's an unknown unknown, and I think it's everywhere else. So I'm trying to get connection. I'm trying to get, at the very least, appeasement of the distress of disconnection, even if I don't know what that is. And that looks perhaps like, and this is a quote from you, hierarchy, status, domination. And then from there, that kind of life is alienation from nature and meaningful relationships. And you speak to this as a society of hungry ghosts, because we're going around and we're trying to get what ultimately is like our unmet neurological needs met from childhood, met in adulthood in all these weird, distorted ways. And we're attempting to forever fill a void that can't be filled, because we're not trying to fill it with the thing that we need, which is connection, even as we're taking from others and others are taking from us. And then that is the cycle of competitive detachment. So I think I just ended up excitedly trying to paraphrasing what I understand about your work, but I would love for you to, I thought it was going to be a question. I'd love for you to expand on that if you have anything else to say.
I think not only do we seek to fill that hole, it's like we have a basic fault or a primal wound, which different theorists talk about, psychotherapists. It never gets filled completely unless we go through some extensive healing. Because it was during a sensitive period that gap developed. So we can see that when you leave babies unnested in different ways, you may not see the results right away because the brain is so plastic initially, especially, and it sort of compensates. But then in adolescence, they may have depression, anxiety, suicidality, because the gap now matters, because the brain cannot no longer compensate, or it can happen in adulthood too. And so there are missing pieces of that connected brain within itself. So one key part of the brain that develops in early life is the right hemisphere. It's scheduled to develop more rapidly in the early years. And it's most of our unconscious, subconscious is guided there. The vagus nerve is governed there. And that's supposed to be growing in all those social connection ways. Our ability to be relationally attuned to others is really housed there initially. And when it doesn't have the appropriate support, the nest, it's not going to grow that well. And so you'll see this. Oh, I keep thinking of more things to add. Boys especially need the nest. They grow more slowly. They develop more slowly. That's just the way they are tuned up. And they have fewer built-in resilience. Girls have more. And so boys need more of this nest and for longer. And so you can see then that boys become more rigid, more dominant submission oriented, in part, I think, because they were not nested enough, long enough, deep enough, etc. And so Dan Siegel talks about couples coming in from their children having left the home, the empty nest, and the women are ready to go out and travel the world, and the guys just want to stay home in their man caves, right? They don't feel like they want to connect. And he attributes it to this lack of right brain development in early life. But you can heal it by putting yourself in situations where you have to be face-to-face, socially connected to others, or some artistic kind of creative flow experiences. And that will grow the right hemisphere even later in life. So there's hope there. So I forgot now where I was going because... Go ahead.
Yeah, I did want to ask explicitly about at some point about boys being more sensitive because, generally when we look at the sort of statistics, men are more likely to be committing crimes, going to prison, committing violent assaults. We have a ultimately white male supremacy sort of structure in society. We don't have a person of color, female supremacy society, for example, and we could see if dominance and rigid identity is a way in which we compensate for those things being unmet, it would make sense that if I was a deeply unnested child in a somewhat deeply traumatic society such as the United States, that it would make sense that as I got older, I would find stability in the certainty of an ideology that surrounds my identity that doesn't ask me anything about who I am, but stays on the surface, aka my skin color. And I would find other people who are in alignment with that, and they generally would also be men because they're so I could just see how that nesting could evolve these types of hierarchy structures. And obviously that's a big and important one. Sexism, for example, racism, all the rest, but it expresses in different contexts, obviously. But that having been said, and setting that aside, unless you'd like to comment on that further.
Well, I think we also have to realize that we do a lot of male circumcision in the United States unnecessarily, with this mythology about it. And that's the early trauma. That's sexual trauma when the baby is a newborn. That has an impact on the brain. There's studies showing that. The inability to express emotion, for example, alexithymia, and just long-term distress and issues with sexuality later, and on and on. And I wonder if the incels are reacting in part to that. So when we undercare for boys, it's just it ruins their lives because they don't have the social capacities to get along, and woo the whatever, a sexual partner or whatever it is, and it's just tragic, and it's really hard to repair the physiological damage that's been done. But the orientation that males have typically is externalized, to blame, to target others as being the problem. I feel bad, it's your fault, right? And so the domestic abuser or whoever, it's those immigrants, right? It's those colored people that aren't my color, or whatever it is. Women tend to have more of the internalizing, to blame the self. There's something wrong with me. I'm a loser, or whatever. So that's internalizing, externalizing. Those are signals then that something went wrong in early life. If you're oriented to that, something, somehow you were mistreated, you were not treated with dignity, with welcoming, with, and to feel that self-confidence that you see in these societies that provide the nest. Everyone is so happy, just deep down happy and thriving. They're thriving. We're now talking about, in our evolvednest.org, we're starting to talk more about what thriving looks like, and to have that sense of should be our goal. Everyone should reach thriving, but we kind of don't even have an idea of what that means. And we think this is normal, to be stressed all the time, to be distressed, to be, angry and resentful, and and then the society pushes that all on us too. I mean, it's really hard to make a living if you're not in the top 10%, right? It's like, what a way to live in the richest country in the world. Sorry, I'm going off on politics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and something you were mentioning there about the sort of general, differences between how men and women, or males and females, tend to respond. It inclines me to be like, oh, that makes sense. Like, for example, and this is not always the case, but the general trend, sort of the male physical abuser finds a female who is likely to submit themselves to that kind of harm. So it's like, if what you're talking about, if that's the trend, it would make sense. Like, if part of my safety is to blame myself for harms, then putting myself in a situation where somebody blames me for issues and hurts me for them is sort of like a weird type of congruence being made. That's this sort of distorted satisfaction of like, yes, it's true, I am bad, and vice versa for someone who would be the explicit sort of physical abuser. Now, I also understand it's not always that clear of a divide. It's often much more complicated and a dance back and forth in abusive relationships, regardless of gender or biological sex. So I put that there too. But what I'd like to get at is okay, so connection. Connection is this nourishment. And when we're coming from connection, we offer connection. And when we're in disconnection, it distresses us. And I want to talk about essentially pandemic isolation, because one of the things I had intended to have the article up so I could reference it, but I had read an article recently, a research article that showed that there's a lot of, there's a change in people's nervous systems where there's an increased anxiety response in a lot of people explicitly as a consequence of the pandemic, both the isolation, but also the looming threat of the virus, of the economy, of the lies of the politicians, for example, or the manufactured consent or whatever it is. And also, of course, past that for anyone paying attention, assuming that they're allowing the recognition of this, is climate change that is informing all of this and worsening in the background. And that our nervous systems are being damaged by this. We're also seeing a huge rise in polarization, conspiracy. That's a big topic during the pandemic. What is your take on, from your evolved nest model, what is your take on the consequences of the sort of sheltering in place pandemic isolation thing that most of us were at least told we were supposed to be in, if not forcibly in, how that's impacting us individually, relationally, and on a larger societal scale?
Well, I think we have to realize that our sense of connection as it evolved wasn't just with other people, it was with the natural world, right? So our connection, if our brain is working fully as human beings, is with the trees, with the birds, with the waterways, with the winds, so that if you're in that receptive intelligence mode, the indigenous worldview, you're not alone. Even if you're alone from not with other people, you're never alone. Never. The spider is nearby, right? Or whatever it is. So I think it's important to expand our sense of connection, our relationships to the relational web that we're in. And everything we do, even when we're not with other people, is affecting everything else, that we are related and affecting their well-being, of the birds, of the waterways, of the insects. And so I think it's important to shift out of that anthropocentric orientation that we're taught to have, that only humans really matter, only humans have spirit,
it's another
only
hierarchy.
Yeah. Right. So the indigenous worldview is like, no. We're part of this whole dynamic universe of relationships already. We're webbed and webbed every moment of the day. And when you have that enlightenment, it's like, you can be at peace. Now, the other part of that is more of a spiritual aspect, that we are not just this body. I am not just this body. I am a self that's part of the whole universe. And so when this body dies or leaves or whatever happens, I'm part of the whole thing. I'm not going anywhere, right? So a lot of anxiety comes from attaching again to one thing, one identity, one way of being. It's that rigidity, that lack of, spiritual intelligence, perhaps, that we are taught to have, right? That it's just you and, your passions and your body. And of course, don't get too much into your body, just be in your head. And then anyway, it's a crazy mess we've made of human beings. And then it's not surprising then that with all these people that are stress reactive already, and you put them in these situations and you've cut off all their sense of relationships to everything else, are going to feel rather scared to death, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that's what we have, and we have to expand people's ability to perceive something grander, something more connected that they're already in. They're blinded, because they've been taught to ignore their connections to the bird, in school. Don't look out the window and watch the birds. No, learn this piece of information, and don't get in touch with your intuitions and your heart sense and your deeper self. No. That's not important, right? So now we have to get back to those things. The things that make us human are that heart connection, that sense of caring for the rest of nature, to be a steward, to be a partner with all the other life forms. And I think that's where I like to put people's attention. And we did a study a couple years ago that was published on ecological attachment. And then we found that after 3 weeks of doing something each day to connect to the natural world, like pay attention to the trees as you walk across campus today. This was undergraduates. That after 3 weeks, they had more ecological empathy, more connection to the natural world. And people can find those 28 days of eco-attachment dance, eco-attachment.dance.
Cool. I actually read an article recently, a paper explicitly about that research, and I because I was just quickly making notes, I only looked at the first author. I wonder if it was the same paper that I accidentally found that you're linked to there. What I think also for me is like creating a framing, and this this is for the listener. I'm saying this now. You'll probably find it interesting as well, because I hope that, in listening to this podcast, people won't be like, oh, cool, what a bunch of sweet, cool ideas. They'll be like, whoa, from here, perhaps I can make practical steps forward. And if, for example, they have the mind of like, oh, I'll go into the connecting beyond the human world, but it's like, oh, I need connection. I'm damaged by a lack of connection. My nervous system's actually been damaged as a consequence of the pandemic isolation and all the rest. And as a consequence, I'm more likely to be anxious and self-protective and self-centered. Well, that might explain why I'm, for myself and a number of people I know, we all just feel so busy. But we have just as much stuff going on as before the pandemic. It's not that we have more things happening. It's that we're more stressed by everything. We have a lower threshold for an anxiety response by a stressor. And that also why, and I've actively been like, no, I'm going to change this, is that I would incline myself, not even when things were more open and everyone around me, like whatever vaccination status doesn't matter, people were like into connecting, that there was still like I don't want to. There's like I'd rather just be at home, and that's that self-protection, the sort of like fear stuff. And people having in mind like, oh, that might be what's alive for me now, as like a framing of like, oh, it's not about, like meditation or whatever, or blah, blah, blah. It's about, oh, I need to come back into healing my nervous system through like co-regulating connection. And that nature connection is a part of that. So I just did an interview with a guy named Sky Otter, Bill Pfeiffer. He talked quite a bit about nature connection. There's an episode about that. You might enjoy it. I imagine you're quite busy, or have a lot on the go. But the reason I want to focus in now, or what I want to focus in on now, is from that what you said about nature connection and connection to something beyond us, is what kind of practices, like you mentioned that acknowledging nature around us, if there's any other kinds of practices that you might suggest as being, effective tools that we could use to start healing this connection, or this healing the damage of this disconnection, coming back into sort of a more regulated nervous system.
Right. Yes, I think this is really important. There are a lot of things to get in touch with nature. A simple one is to just lie down on the grass and hang out there for an hour and just let the earth. So we call this earthing, right? And there is evidence that it lowers cortisol. It can increase oxytocin, the cuddle hormone, right? There's also earthing blankets, so that if you're in a cold season, you could plug that in and get the same kind of experience or similar. And then one of the things that we really miss in our society is the vision quest, or vision quests that children often go through in Native communities, where they go off, they're prepared, they're not encouraged to do this until they're ready to do it as developmentally. They go off for a day or two to spend time in the wild outdoors alone and find their connection to the universe. And so I've done with my students, just taken them to a state park and then had them for 3 hours wander around on their own and feel connected, find their connection, find things. And several of them would say, wow, that was cool, right? And that settles you down, because it takes you out of that school mind or work mind, where you also have to get stuff done on your list, a checklist, or someone's hanging over you to, waiting for this or that, and you to do this or that. And you go and you just connect to the natural world. It's like amazing. You just have to be here as an earth creature. You don't have to do all this other stuff. It sort of recenters you about what's important. And to do that regularly, just even having 5 minutes of sitting against a tree or looking out on a beautiful forested environment, all these things can help calm you down. And then doing some belly breathing to go with that. My students, I would have them learn to do the belly breathing. So that's actually tuning up your vagus nerve, which again, I mentioned earlier, is related to all sorts of health in various forms of your body. And then what we also did in our class that's settling down those survival systems when you belly breathe, when you're connecting to nature. But a lot of us, if we were left in the crib alone or left with an iPad or iPhone or something as a baby, as a young child, or isolated a lot. I grew up half my childhood overseas and spent a lot of time alone just because of the way our neighborhoods were and all that. If you haven't then developed that social, all those social capacities, what we did in my class is we'd play folk song games. So games like a hunting we will go, a hunting we will go, we'll catch a little fox and put him in a box and then we'll let him go. And we play these in a circle, and everyone has to be there, and you end up laughing and smiling, looking at people's eyes, you're touching them, and it builds the capacities to actually, that right brain, to get along and to enjoy being with others. So there's those aspects too, to find ways to reconnect to others in joyful ways and build that sense of comunitas. I just wrote a blog recently about that blog post. And that's where you have a sense of just being connected to everybody and you forget about status or differences or anything, but we're all one. And so you want to have moments where that is encouraged, which in our ancestral context happened all the time. But we have forgotten how to do that. And so a lot of what the nest and what we now call the wellness-informed pathway is to remember, restore our ways of becoming human. And that's something that we can all participate in, even just by, saying hello to some stranger on the street, smiling at them. Anything you can do to connect to another person is going to help reconnect our web, our sense of the web. We're always connected, but it's our sense and our perception that also matters.
Yeah, one of the things that my housemates and my partner and I we've been talking about is like, how can we utilize the community that is our household as a place for an ecology of connection practices. Like recognizing like, oh, the problem isn't I work too much. The problem is a matter of stress, disconnection, and a lack of co-regulation, and a very intentional effort being put towards sort of creating relationships and a micro community of people who are, committing to connection practices with each other, be they conversations or other types of practices. I don't know if you've heard of this, like authentic relating or circling. Or even just playing games just for fun. It's not about trying to connect. It's just about being together in a playful, positive, creative way. Earlier, I was inclining myself towards this question, and then I got self-conscious and then like limited it down out of like a fear of the question maybe coming out of left field, perhaps not, given that I think you have a sense of my podcast, is around psychedelics and psychedelic therapy. And I don't know what your understanding of this is now, so I'd be happy to hear any thoughts that you have around it. Because when you speak about nature connection and sort of spiritual connection and how that can change our sense of being isolated when there are no people around, and even our sense of, like death being an ultimate end, oblivion, stop, don't, is that out of psychedelics, there can be on the mystical end, a strong sense of all of a sudden being like, oh, I am connected, like with a capital C, like I am part of connection. That's the foundation of my being. And on another level, especially outside, there's the inclination, the boundaries of oneself dissolve, and you feel the world around you as if it is yourself, like nature touches you in the very essence of your sense of self. And it's not even being touched, it's just being at that point. And the consequence oftentimes being, in natural settings, research suggests increased nature relatedness, which comes with increased well-being, life meaning, and a number of other things. So I'm wondering if you have any comments or anything in particular that's come up in your work as the field of psychedelic research and therapy has been growing over the years. Any comments or things you'd like to point out?
It's not an area I study or work in, but I I think that it can be very valuable, especially for people who have those gaps and who are in depression and anxiety. But they shouldn't be doing it alone. They should have a guide who's wise, as a shaman, shamanic practices, reliable people who can guide them through that. And I know there's experiments going on with these things and therapies that are becoming available as well. So I'd be cautious about using it alone because people can have bad trips, so to speak, if they don't know what they're seeing or feeling or whatever. So I'd be cautious about that. But otherwise, I do think it is a traditional way of reconnecting and getting more back in balance. One of those routine healing practices that we see in traditional societies.
Yeah, interesting. I wasn't sure, like, given tracking your work, I'm like, oh, this overlaps so much, but I had no sense of whether or not you had any, whether or not you were explicitly following any of the research trends or any of that material. So we're totally at the end of the questions that I had. And I'm wondering if there's anything out of the conversation that you feel, I didn't ask, but I should have asked, or feels like important to put in for the people listening as something to carry from here.
Well, I could just say a few more things that we have some more recent work coming out. So I mentioned the wellness informed pathway. And so that's really what we can see was part of our ancestral context. And that's why we're here. It's because they followed that pathway, which is meeting basic needs of the young and of everybody, every age, through the evolved nest, which is not just in early life, but is important for the rest of life, to feel connected, to relate, to have mentors, to have touch, to have play throughout life, really important. And that promotes then thriving and ways of healing. And then that develops this heart-mindedness that I mentioned that is really central to being a human being, that guides the individual, but also the community. And then there's at the same time, a sense of know-how for getting along on the earth. So an ecological, sustainable lifestyle, which is part of our heritage as well. And we've forgotten most of these pieces, right? We forgot what thriving even looks like. And I would like to mention a few of those. I have a list here somewhere of what those characteristics are. They include, having a quiet mind, having enjoying being with others and having empathy and unconditional love, being authentic and honest, having a sense of belonging, being able to connect to something beyond the self, to self-actualize, and to be really autonomous, and all sorts of other things too. So I think it's important to have a sense of what thriving looks like, and we can see then how we're failing to get there, and let's make pathways to get there, and the nest is part of that pathway, important part. Otherwise, we are in the trauma-inducing pathway, which is where we don't meet the needs of people. We don't expect thriving. We expect aggression and selfishness. And then we don't have a heart-minded orientation. We have an uncompassionate community, competitive community, and we don't know how to get along on the earth. Instead, we're destroying the earth because we have those holes in our hearts. We have these gaps, and our inability to even receptively receive the communications of the planet. And we're just so self-centered, necessarily so because we've been conditioned to be that way. So we need to move back to that wellness promoting pathway and promote that cycle of cooperative companionship.
Yeah, I love that. One of the things that excites me about your work, there's one level which is like, oh, this could positively benefit my well-being and the well-being of the people I care about. And the other layer is like, oh, this is creating a framing that allows, like you said, an understanding of what human flourishing does look like, this wellness, what you call wellness-informed pathway. But also sort of an understanding of like, oh, where have things perhaps gone off the rails, like gone off track? And with that in mind, am I able to sort of now self-track things and start to align myself more towards this ideal? Like, oh, now I know where the top of the mountain is. I don't exactly know how to get there, but I am able to notice when I'm actually headed towards, the cliff, now that I realize I've been heading towards the cliff my whole life or something like that. And that staying with this metaphor, moving towards the top of the mountain individually and relationally, communally, is an absolutely necessary prerequisite for being able to do so collectively on a social and civilizational level, which we have to do because we are, I didn't realize I was making this metaphor, headed towards a cliff. We're driving the bus straight towards a cliff right now. So yeah, your work to me feels inspiring because of the empowerment it can offer people to start changing themselves and changing their lives towards this, what I believe to be the necessary prerequisite for, shifting the arc of where our civilization is going back towards humanity, like our humanness. So thank you for that.
Oh, it's brilliant. Yeah, you've got everything so well articulated. I love it.
So to close us out, maybe you could give us the links and tags and handles in order for people to move towards the sort of catalog of your work where they can learn more.
I guess the primary one is evolvednest.org. You can also look at kindredmedia.org. And then I have my own website, which has a lot of academic papers to download and other things at the University of Notre Dame or through them. And there's also my Psychology Today, the online magazine. I have a blog there called Moral Landscapes.
Great. Well, I'll make sure all of those are linked in the show notes to this episode at jameswjesso.com, as listeners do know. Dr. Darcia Narvaez, thank you so much for taking the time today for your work, like I said, and even for jumping on a call with me for a second time. I really appreciate it.
Oh, I loved it. Yeah, thanks so much. I appreciate it, James.
And cut. Okay, thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Adventures Through the Mind. If you enjoyed it, please share it with a friend. If you found value in it and you'd like to contribute to the show financially, you can do so by becoming a patron on Patreon, leaving a one-time donation, PayPal or cryptocurrency, or purchasing something off the online shop like a t-shirt, or you could purchase something from one of our affiliates, such as the Portal Box, which is a very cool sort of custom-made wooden box that can hold a vaporizer and a journey note and a scale, and it's sort of a sacred place to hold the things that facilitate your tea experiences, if y'all know what I'm talking about. So there's that, and there's also you can purchase from Mushroom Revival, which is my favorite functional mushroom supplement company. Presently, their lion's mane has been essential for me recently. So there are some discount codes that are available. You can see the description to this episode to link over to that information. But yeah, thank you anyways for just tuning in. And I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope that whatever comes, and I hope that what you heard in this episode positively impacts your life and your relationships, as it has for me. And that's all. Thanks so much. And until the next episode of Adventures Through the Mind, take care.